Okay, welcome. This is now officially the most popular session of the whole event. Woo! So no pressure. So this is the session on impact. And from listening to the previous sessions, you could think that the way impact is framed as what we need to do and show to justify what we've done so far with the money we got so far and justify getting more, right? That's how impact is framed. And certainly I'm an academic embedded in the policy lab in the Cabinet Office that Paul Maltby was talking about this morning. That's certainly, in a sense, the way that impact is being talked about. But here we've got an amazing panel who over the next 40 minutes are going to share with us experiences that come from, we're going to open up the question of impact for us. They're going to look at digital sense-making, business and technology innovation, ethnographically informed research and prototyping, and new formats for governance and new kinds of tools for governance. So we're going to explore all of that really fast with 5 minutes each from our speakers. And starting on my left with Dave Snowden, who has had all sorts of roles, including at IBM, but is the co-founder of Cognitive Edge, but also involved with the University of Bangor in Wales, which is not part of England for anyone who wants to check that. Then we're going to have Satsuko VanAntwerp, who's from InWithForward, whose description of what they do is turning social safety nets into trampolines, who's currently working in Canada, prototyping a new service around people with cognitive impairment. Then we're going to have Chris Tan, who's director of Big Fast Results, which is in the Prime Minister's delivery unit of Malaysia and has previous roles in business, including in Intel for an extended period. And then finally, Stefaan Verhulst from GovLab at NYU, who has a long background of leading very practical action research. Stefan's going to be conceptual. Chris is going to be a dreamer. Satsuko is going to be grounded, and we're going to start with Dave, who's going to be provocative about impact.
Okay, well, let's start in that spirit, all right? My original degree is physics and philosophy. As a joint honours, that taught me to have a contempt for social science from two completely different disciplines. And working in the development sector hasn't changed my mind on that remotely. If anything, it's reinforced it. Three basics, the work we're doing. This is at the new Centre for Applied Complexity at Bangor University, where we're really trying to move labs into whole country experiments rather than physical centres, i.e. mass engagement over huge populations, doing what we've already done in Colombia and elsewhere. Three basic scientific backgrounds to this sort of stuff. First of all, if you look at all of the available scientific research, it says where people are working for explicit measurable goals, it inevitably destroys intrinsic motivation. There is no evidence to contradict that. All the evidence states that. The one thing we need in public policy above all else is intrinsically motivated people, and we're destroying it by the way we currently measure. Right? So that's 101 science. Yeah? Secondly, I come from a complex adaptive systems background, which should not be confused with systems thinking. It's completely different. One of the reasons for that is complexity deals with systems which have no inherent linear causality. They have dispositionality. So you can measure how a system is disposed to evolve, but you can never say, if I do this, it will produce that result. Which actually means most human systems are complex adaptive systems, and it means you can't define outcomes, because if you define outcomes, you limit the areas that you explore. It's just fundamentally flawed, right? A system can only have outcomes defined if it has linear material cause in terms of the way it works. And the third area which comes from this is a thing called inattentional bias. So, for example, famous experiments, you give a bunch of radiologists a series of x-rays, you ask them to look for cancer nodules. On one of the x-rays, you hide a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. 83% of the radiologists miss it, even though their eyes actually scan it. Yeah, so systems based on expert assessment or X-ray appraisal are also flawed in principle. Yeah? And kind of like a final addition to that, most of the time we're dealing with what's called abductive, not inductive research. Inductive is case-based approaches, which assumes you've got enough repetition to make predictions about the future. Abduction is the form of logic which makes connections between things which are apparently unconnected. Yeah? So it's far more appropriate for innovation. So to give an illustration of the work we're doing, what we're doing is what's been called distributed or scalable ethnography. And I'm deliberately using the ethnographic word because it does not mean having conversations with people. It actually means the exact opposite of that. It means allowing people to speak for themselves and observing them and not influencing them in any way whatsoever. Right? So the work we do on ethnography is literally to get people to be their own ethnographers. Yeah, so for example, with Roma kids acting as ethnographers to Roma communities in Eastern Europe, we've got access to observations and narratives that nobody has got before. Using young kids who've been sexually molested in Africa as ethnographers into people at their own communities at their own risk. We've also got stories and observations nobody's got before. When they interpret their own stories, and this is a quantitative technique, not a qualitative technique, and I want to emphasize that. When they interpret their own stories, they see there are many possibilities for intervention available. When we give the same stories to experts for expert appraisal, they narrow down the range of possibilities based on an instrumental approach, and we've done that on a consistent basis. Right? So, for example, with Children of the World, which is the flagship project of the new centre, we've already done this in Libya, Egypt, Colombia, Glasgow. I treat Glasgow as a separate country in this respect. We told the kids they couldn't actually steal the iPods, so they didn't. They changed the passwords and blackmailed us to get the passwords. Right? We rewarded them for enterprise on that. Right? But the concept here is to get and in Washington on this, because we're close to getting the final funding for this now, is to get every child of the age of 16 in every school in every country of the world to go out into their communities to gather stories which are self-signified at the point of origin into a quantitative framework. That will give us a database to measure impact independently of individual processes. It also allows us to draw what are called fitness landscapes in complexity, which are basically probability distributions over multiple observations, which allow us to measure whether how something is moving, and also to measure its potential. And interestingly, it also gives you a form of innovation, because people can link and connect ideas horizontally without mediation through the centre. And that leaves me with the final message. That means we can measure vectors, and this is kind of like the big new thing. You measure vectors, not outcome. And a vector is direction and pace of travel. And that allows you to be open to other possibilities.
Okay, that was the starting provocation, thank you. And now we move on to Satsuko, who's going to be grounded and talk about details from an actual live project.
Great, thank you. So we were told no slides, so my designers made me a storybook. So there's one on the floor there and one there. So I'm going to try to speak and also show the corresponding photos. I don't know how well that's going to go, but we can try. Yes, so as Lucy mentioned, I'm part of InWithForward, and our goal is to transition our welfare systems from social safety nets to trampolines, to enable individuals and families to flourish rather than simply to protect them from harm. So over the past 10 years, the directors of InWithForward have worked in 5 countries on issues ranging from domestic violence to aged care, including the design of family-by-family prototype. So we try to shift our welfare systems by doing deep, immersive ethnographic work to reset what constitutes good outcomes. Then we prototype new theories of change. So that means prototyping the interactions. So this is what that looks like. Oh, thank you. And we think that, so we're trying to shift the determinants of those outcomes and test new ways to measure change in the outcomes over time. So for example, after 3 months of living with folks with cognitive disabilities in apartment 303 of a social housing complex, we redefined what constitutes a good outcome. So the disability system said that a good outcome was if people were not socially isolated. But they didn't actually measure that outcome. They only measured the number of hours of support a person had in their life and the number of connections that the person had in community. So let's see. So this is Faye. Faye received 16 hours of support a week from a service provider and had over 11 connections in her life, which is a high number. And yet she still felt bored, lonely, and didn't have so much to talk about. What Faye actually lacked was a source of novelty and learning. She wanted to have something else to talk about rather than her next medical surgery. So with Faye and 50 other folks, we started to see that good outcomes wasn't simply connections. It was connections to people and places that could build a sense of self and also have a more positive outlook on the future. So to achieve that outcome, we'd need to co-design a whole new set of interactions and a whole new measurement system. So that's what's become a new service called Kudos. Kudos is a platform for learning and exchange. It's where small business owners, freelancers, students, family members, they sign up to host a 1-hour learning experience. And these range from everything from botany in a forest to building props in a theater. So how it works is that individuals with a cognitive disability can log into an online catalog, and they can look through it and choose a badge to work on, sign up for experiences. And these experiences aim to widen and deepen their interests and their networks in these interest areas. So while we are doing this, we are tracking the change in Kadoers. So we call the people who are with cognitive disabilities who go on these experiences, we call them Kadoers. And we track the changes via their online profile. And I have a picture of that too, I think. So, yes, thank you so much. It's good at that. So so we're tracking whether there's a change in their voice. So how are they perceiving themselves? What words are they using to describe themselves? We're tracking the changes, so how they're spending their time and how that's changing. We're also tracking their purpose. How are they talking about their goals? Are they're starting to stretch their goals? Their independence. Are they increasing their level of initiation and responsiveness and curiosity and communication? And skills, are they earning more badges and reflecting on the different things they've learned? So these are the things that we're looking at on this dashboard. And we know from social cognitive career choice theory that if we increase people's set of experiences, shape their interests and outcome expectations, and build interest-based networks, we have a good shot at increasing their employability and their financial independence. And these are two things that the disability sector cares a lot about. So getting to this theory of change and the measurement tools has taken over 15 iterations, and we're still not there yet. We have much more to design and prototype to do that. And that's because measurement needs to uphold to 3 important principles. Oh, I missed a couple pictures, but that is okay. We'll skip ahead. So these are the principles.
1, 2, 3.
So principle 1 is that data is a learning tool, not an accountability tool. So we're using this data to actually, time's up. Okay. So data is owned and accessed by individuals themselves, and the third one is data is collected as a meaningful and reflective experience. So we see how much the social impact conversation is dominated by a focus on large-scale studies, on randomized control trials, and using open data sets. But we believe that before we can get to all this, you need to get good data. So in the disability space and every other space we've worked in, from child protection in Australia to homelessness in Toronto, the existing data tells us very little about what matters to people. It tells us how many hours of professional care is offered and how satisfied people are, but it doesn't tell us what is changing for whom, when, and why. And the poor data that does exist is collected in a way that's obtrusive and often antithetical to the behavior change. That's why prototyping from the front-end measurement experience and the back-end systems for capturing and visualizing this data in real time is so important and so hard to do. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay, so Dave told us that outcomes were the wrong way to think about things. Satsuko has told us, given us a more relational view of what outcomes are. And now Chris is going to be a dreamer.
Yes, and I'm a dreamer because our outcomes will not be seen for another 10 years. So we're working in PEMANDU on a program to achieve the objectives of a national vision that was initially unveiled in 1991, but for the last 20 years had not seen much progress. And here we are jumping in to try to accelerate the implementations, to try to hit the goal by 2020. Okay, and we got 5 years left. So that's why when Liz asked me what I wanted to be, I'm a dreamer. Now the program for us in Malaysia is a macro one. So unlike you guys, most of you, we don't work on individual, just one project at a time. So we are as we speak, we are coordinating at least a couple of hundred individual programs that are intended to collectively drive the per capita gross national income of the nation to a certain level by the year 2020, and when we started the program, our GNI per capita was under $7,000. We set ourselves a very ambitious target of $15,000 by 2020. Gave ourselves 10 years to get there, but I'm happy to say that we have increased our GNI by 50% in the last 4 years. Now, we do this by way of I wouldn't call this innovation labs per se, because the innovations happen sectorally. Whereas, as Bill Eggers spoke about this morning, you need a huge framework, right, where somebody needs to take the job of actually pulling the different pieces together. And that's exactly what PEMANDU does. I kind of regret not being able to sit in all the breakouts, because every single one of those breakout topics is actually relevant to putting those pieces together. So the economic angle, the political angle, assembling the ecosystem, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, because we set ourselves a 10-year target, this is not something that I potentially will live to see. Okay, I might be out of a job. The status, the nature of catalysts is to go away after the reaction is complete, right? So we know that the real job of implementing the changes that we want to see in society actually belong to the institutions that were originally established for that purpose, right? So the mainline the ministries, the various departments and agencies, and so on and so forth. Our delivery unit is by definition a catalyst which has a finite lifespan. So in order for us to do that, okay, already. Wow. Okay. In order for us to do this, okay, we run these labs where we include everybody into the. So it's not by a collection of smart intellectuals who come in and use all these fancy terms that everybody is now debating, right? But we actually work with the civil servants, get them together to create these detailed long-term plans, okay? Detailed to the degree that we actually document who actually does what within each ministry, with what budget, with what target, at what time frame for the next 10 years. Okay? And it's all documented in a book. Right? Now, the purpose of that book is to make the entire government administration pregnant. Right? And we do that by way of actually doing this public forums. All right? Where the government actually unveils these detailed plans to the citizens, all right, and then documents captures all the feedback from the citizens into the book, all right, which then creates a roadmap for the next 10 years, which then says that if Chris Tan leaves his job tomorrow, or if the Prime Minister leaves his job tomorrow, somebody else will know how to carry on the task for the next 10 years. Now, going back to the issue of how do we measure the impact, all right? I think Dave here just stole my thunder with his closing remarks. Okay, it's all about measuring the vector, not the outcome, right? Because we will not be here in 2020 potentially to actually measure, but we absolutely measure the progress of the indicators week by week, month by month, year by year, all right? And the thing that I think is the most impactful that we've done in Malaysia, okay, is that we actually employ third-party auditors, private auditors, not government auditors, to audit the results, and we communicate these results to the very people that we consulted every year by way of annual reports. So this is a government in Malaysia that actually publishes annual reports just like we would do in a corporation. And this is how we keep the administration firmly on track. We keep them committed by way of reminding them what you promised to do, and we show them the progress of their indicators to keep them encouraged, Okay, and that's how we manage impact.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Stefaan is going to be conceptual.
Yeah, I'm going to try to be conceptual after, anyway, a bunch of great interventions, which I only can, of course, agree with. So what I was planning on doing was basically giving like a conceptual framework to think about impact based upon the work we do at GovLab, but also based upon the work that I did in my previous life when I was head of research for a private foundation. And as you know, every foundation is somewhat obsessed with impact at certain points in time. And so I want to do that by basically reflecting on 3 maxims that are traditionally associated with impact studies. And the first maxim that that everyone knows and that has been contributed to, I think, at least 100 people, is that you cannot manage change unless you measure it. And to a large extent, of course, that is really what drives this anxiety towards actually impact, is that they feel like, and there is quite often a valid case to be made, is that you can actually only manage change or instigate change unless you also measure whether you get closer to actually the change you want to have. And that's, of course, we can have a whole debate about what that is. And so that's really what drives quite often the field of impact assessment, which is how can we actually use impact assessment to then also translate that into redirection and ultimately an assessment of what, and especially in this field, what governments are doing, whether this is on the right track. And to a large extent, actually, we don't do enough impact assessment to even evaluate whether a change is managed in a proper way. Now, the question is, of course, what should we measure in order to ultimately manage that better? And traditionally, there are around 5 issues that always comes up as needs to measure, and I call these the 5 S's of impact assessment. The first S of impact assessment is always about, of course, well, does it provide a solution, right? And then the question is, of course, what is a solution? And you assume that a solution, of course, has some kind of a problem that needs to be solved. And too often, we see that actually that is already the first challenge, i.e. what is the real problem that we are trying to solve with the innovation that we actually try to instigate. And too often we go to actually focusing on the solution, which automatically skews actually the impact assessment. But anyway, so that's the first S. The second S quite often is then, have we been systemic? And that assumes, again, a notion that we actually have a vision of a system that can be changed as a result of a particular kind of intervention. And so this whole systems map analysis, and we can have, David and I can have a whole debate about what that should look like or what the methodology should be, or whether you actually can talk about systems map. But that clearly is out there as a particular need. The third S is then the S of scale. To what extent can we actually assess based upon the measurement whether this scales? And we've heard over and over again already today that the need for scalability is clear, and so that should be part of every impact assessment, is at least a reflection on scalability of the innovation, which is here at the core focus. The fourth S is then to do with speed. And we should not underestimate that temporal assessment are very important as well, i.e. to what extent does the innovation actually instigate change, and at what speed does it instigate change? Because we have people like Chris who actually don't care whether it is within his lifetime, but policymakers actually do care that change happens under their watch. And I think that's the reason why it's important to also be sensitive to that need of speed and a sensitive. These are quick minutes, I have to say. I'm talking about speed. Sensitive to the sensitive to that. And then the last S is the S of saving, i.e. did the innovation and the intervention actually save us any money as well? Because we all operate in the real world. And especially at the time of austerity, I think it's important to also have this cost element actually associated with an impact assessment and is being demanded all the time to a large extent. And so these are the 5 S's that traditionally are associated with this measurement. Now the second maxim, and I'm going to go very quickly now, the second maxim, of course, which is very important, which David also referenced to, is that to a large extent, while we know that those S's determine or should determine at least how we talk about impact, to a large extent we measure what we value. And that automatically implies that whatever we value, whatever we measure is biased, because otherwise we probably shouldn't measure it if we wouldn't value it. And so the question here is then, of course, so what are the values embedded in whatever impact assessment you make? And make that at least transparent is an important element. Now that also means that if you really want to be somewhat sensitive to the beneficiaries, it might actually be important to actually engage the beneficiaries in identifying the indicators. Because ultimately that might actually be then what you're going to measure. And so you don't measure what you value, but you measure what actually the beneficiaries that you actually try to address value. And so that's the reason why developing indicators in a participatory manner is very important and should be actually seen as a toolkit for innovation labs as such as well. The other element here that I want to measure is that quite often we measure the value proposition, and the value proposition should also include a risk proposition. It's not only about the benefit that you want to achieve, but it's also about the risk that actually you either want to prevent or you want to also the risk that you want to be aware of. The third maxim is, and that's the last one, is that we cannot measure change unless you measure it. 2, we measure what we value. The third is then the danger of measuring, which is that we actually start to value what we measure. And that becomes then ultimately then quite often what we really start caring about, because that's what we can measure. And we have multiple examples. Education is the best example of actually that dangerous path of indicators, is that certainly we start to educate according to the indicator, i.e. the test result, as opposed to ultimately creating some kind of a broad education. And that can also happen in innovation labs, where if that's the indicator, then actually you start to value the indicator, and that might not be the best way to go about even policy development. Many examples, as already said. The last example that I always point to is that there is a reason quite often why in the US, for instance, we have such a challenge with police behavior, and that's to a large extent a result of actually the wrong indicator. And I think that already indicates that indicators matter not only at the abstract level and the conceptual level, but also in real life. And Lucy is getting very nervous with me.
I'm getting nervous. All right.
Time out. We should actually send it.
We've got 11 minutes, I think, for questions, so go straight to the floor. Please, the microphone's going to go round. Please remember to say your name and your organisation.
I'm Helen Bevan and I work for the NHS in England. Both Dave and Chris made the statement, it's all about measuring the vector, not the outcome. So I've been Googling, I've been listening as well, I've been multitasking, okay, about vectors. And it's all getting a bit mathematical and I'm kind of losing it a bit. And the fact that you both said it seems to me that's really important. So can you explain what that means?
Dave?
Thank you.
Sure, no problem. It's nice to see you again, all right? Long time since the KM days, all right? Let's take a very concrete example, all right? So let's take the work we're doing in NHS in Wales at the moment. We've got about 8 or 9 projects running on obesity management, which is just starting. We're looking at early detection of abuse in childhood, home, in elderly care and that sort of area. The way we're doing that is distributed ethnography, which means people make their own observations. They interpret those observations into quantitative frameworks. And from that, effectively, we draw topographical maps in which you can see in the dense contour lines, that's a disposition. And it also critically allows you to see outliers. Right? So a vector says the dispositions are here, we like them to be there. Right? But you move to an achievable goal. So if you haven't already got a cluster of observations in a desired space, it's too far away. And then you sit down with people and you say, what will we do tomorrow to create more stories like this and fewer stories like that? Right? You deliberately do not have an objective, and it's not the same thing as measuring progress statements against an objective, because actually the general direction can change based on what's possible. That's a vector.
Yeah. And I can respond from a slightly different perspective. So it's inaccurate to say I'm not interested in the outcome. The truth of the matter is that my targeted outcome is still 5 years down the road, but I need work to be done today, tomorrow, the day after. So take, for example, the particular program that I drove, the transformation of our electronics industry. We were assigned a target that this industry should generate so many % of the GDP, which contributes so much, so this proportion of the gross national income, on the basis of 20 different projects. Okay, it's inconceivable that 20 projects, 20 companies in the country could actually move the entire industry. So there were lots of different assumptions that were being made about the catalytic effect of one project on the other, and so on and so forth. So if you measured the actual outcome of those 20 projects, you'll see that you'll be very far off from the actual target. So what we do is to take the statistics from the official, the central bank, from the official investment promotion agencies, from the Department of Statistics on job creation, on income levels and investments, and so on and so forth. And then we attribute all the success of, we attribute all the progress, the upward ticks of these various indicators to the success of the individual projects. And this is just a way to encourage continued participation from the entire industry over the remaining 5 years.
You call that scientific?
No, that's
Good.
why I said I'm a dreamer.
Just wanted to double check, all right?
All right, I said that I'm a dreamer. Okay, so we've always struggled with this attribution problem, right? Because our program is a very macro program, right? 12, just 12 economic sectors to drive the country's gross national income. All right. So there are lots of different things. So the whole thing is for these projects to create the required levels of investor confidence to enable the investors themselves to put investment in the country and to create jobs and to raise incomes and so on and so forth. Okay. So it's just connecting the dots, but there's no direct correlation. Okay.
Okay, we've got a question at the back, and then one here.
Thank you. I'm Vicky Green from Bromford Lab in England. My question is you've talked a lot about how you measure the metrics around individual projects or lots of projects. I wonder what the panel feel about measuring the overall sort of performance of an innovation lab. So you talked about your 5 S's, perhaps, about your solutions, systemic, scale. I've been writing notes. Speed and savings. Would you roll those up in terms of, actually, these are all the things that we've been working on? Because one of the things that we're challenging ourselves on are things that you wouldn't perhaps measure in that way. So we're sort of saying things like, actually, a success of our lab is the stupid ideas that we've stopped happening, you know, for example. And I just wondered if you've got any ideas around actually how you would measure the overall sort of performance of a lab. It's something we're challenging ourselves on at the moment. So.
Can I just start, because Satsuko is also an early stage situation rather than a big organisation already doing something. Do you want to maybe answer that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we think about is our lab actually creating a solution that's going to change people's life or change the behavior of the staff supporting these folks with cognitive disabilities. So we are not measuring like, oh, we created this program and you know, it's running, or we want to see that people are acting differently. And that's a lot harder. So we're quite hard on ourselves.
Well, so it depends. I mean, there's a big debate in the evaluation community, right? As to what extent do you need a change theory in order to be able to measure change, right? And so, or is it more of a organic, and then ultimately at certain points in time, you measure vectors, whatever, or outcomes and that kind of stuff. The challenge is, of course, we are all, well, in order to measure ultimately progress, you do need to have a set of understandings about how you want to go about instigating change. And so absent quite often a change theory, or absent a conceptual framework that says, well, these are ultimately the set of roles that, and that's where David and I disagree, the set of roles that you want to play, it's very hard. Meaning, and that's the ideological debate in the evaluation community, and I have no position except for saying that it's very hard, if you don't have that, to even think in terms of what's our role towards the change, and how are we going to then exactly evaluate as an organization whether we have actually come any closer. Now, this is, of course, anyway, complex theory is going to say, well, it's impossible because there are all kinds of variables and vectors that are impossible to measure. But I think from a management perspective, you do need to have that kind of change theory quite often.
So from a scientific perspective, something is impossible, but from a management perspective, we should try and pretend it is. I mean, that's the engineering metaphor, which has dominated far too much for the last 20 or 30 years. The reality is people have a very good understanding of whether they're going in the right direction. We don't empower them to represent that. You've got to have quantitative measures to get attention, but you've got to have narrative explanations for the numbers to get to persuade people to do things. Now, if you actually start off with a clear objective,
well, that's the debate,
you predetermine, it's Goodhart's law. Yeah, in Strathan's variation, the minute a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a measure. You restrict what you're looking for, you don't open up possibilities. Yeah, you start in directions, and this is dynamic reallocation of budgets, what we're doing at the moment. You don't allocate the budget for an end point, you allocate for starting points, you scale not by replication, but by decomposition and reconstruction. And as things start to work, you increase allocation of money to dispositional maps. That is not an engineering model, it's an organic model, and until we make that switch, we'll be in spurious debates about theories of change which get nowhere.
No, I agree, and to a large extent, of course, but again, we don't have to be, anyway, I'm not going to go, but to a large extent, meaning on the one hand you have the cognitive edge kind of model. I mean, a lot of it in the agile development model, to a large extent, takes this into account, right? So this whole model of being agile, and you actually don't, anyway, but you look, you develop, you look what is instigated, so you learn and you develop, and that's to a large extent what is based upon that as well.
I'm reluctant to end something that's got quite so interesting, but obviously there's underlying this as quite significant theoretical differences, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you very much.